In the heart of Raven's Hollow, where time seems to stand still, a family struggles to rebuild their lives. Arthur and Julia Whitlock, once surrounded by their 5 children, now find themselves alone with only their loyal German Shepherd Ranger by their side. The bond between them and this devoted dog goes beyond companionship. It's a lifeline. Ranger's unwavering loyalty provides them the strength to face their hardest days. But as the family battles against the pressures of the past, can the love of a dog truly heal the wounds of abandonment? Watch to find out how Ranger's silent devotion may just be the key to their family's redemption. Don't miss this emotional journey of love, loyalty, and second chances. Arthur and Julia Whitlock built their lives together with love, hard work, and unwavering commitment. In their younger years, they were full of hope and dreams for the future. They had 5 children, each one a cherished treasure, and they poured every ounce of their love into raising them. Despite the challenges that came with raising a large family, they faced them with strength and a shared vision of a happy, fulfilling life. Arthur worked long hours at the factory, always providing for his family, while Julia, with her gentle hands, managed the household, making sure everything was in place. She nurtured their children with care, teaching them the value of hard work and kindness. Every evening, the Whitlock home was filled with laughter, the smell of home-cooked meals, and the warmth of a family that loved one another deeply. Their house, though modest, was a home full of warmth and joy. The children grew up in a secure, loving environment where their parents made every sacrifice to ensure their happiness and success. For Arthur and Julia, family was everything. They shared moments of quiet reflection and joy, watching their children grow into young adults ready to take on the world. It was during these years of stability and happiness that they decided to add a new member to their family, a German Shepherd puppy. They named him Ranger, and from the moment they brought him home, he became an integral part of their lives. With his striking coat and intelligent eyes, Ranger quickly bonded with the family. He was not just a pet. He was a guardian, a companion, and a friend. Ranger's playful nature brought an added joy to the Whitlock home. He would chase the children around the yard, his ears flapping in the wind as they laughed and shouted. At night, he would curl up by the fireplace, content and at peace, always alert to the needs of his family. For Arthur and Julia, Ranger was a reminder of the simple joys of life. The unconditional love of a loyal dog, the laughter of children, and the warmth of a home filled with love. The family's bond with Ranger grew stronger over the years. As the children grew older, Ranger remained steadfast, a symbol of loyalty and companionship. He was there for every milestone, graduations, birthdays, and family celebrations. He became more than just a dog. He was a member of the family, sharing in their happiness and offering comfort during their trials. Arthur often found solace in the quiet moments with Ranger. The dog's presence was a reminder of the love and care that surrounded him. Julia would smile as she watched Arthur and Ranger together, their connection unspoken but deep. Ranger's loyalty was unmatched, and he seemed to understand the Whitlocks in a way that no one else did. But the golden years filled with laughter and love were not meant to last forever. As the children grew and ventured out into the world, the dynamics of the Whitlock family began to shift. And with those changes came challenges that would test the very foundation of the family they had worked so hard to build. The years of peace and happiness began to fade as Arthur and Julia faced challenges they hadn't anticipated. The once sturdy foundation of their family started to crack under the weight of financial struggles and health issues. Arthur's factory job, which had once provided them with security, became less reliable. With the factory facing layoffs and a slow economy, the Whitlocks' financial stability began to erode. Bills piled up, and the house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt more like a burden. Julia's health also began to decline. Years of hard work in the textile mills had taken a toll on her lungs, and her breathing grew more labored with each passing year. What had once been a quiet, strong woman now spent her days struggling to catch her breath, relying on an oxygen tank to assist her. The energetic, vibrant woman who had raised 5 children with such grace and strength was now a shadow of her former self. Despite the growing difficulties, Ranger remained by their side, ever watchful and loyal. He sensed the changes in the house. The tense silences, the increasing worry on Arthur's face, the exhaustion in Julia's steps. At night, when the house was quiet, Ranger would curl up by the fireplace, his head resting on his paws, watching over his family with unwavering devotion. His presence was a small comfort amidst the rising turmoil. As the financial strain deepened, Arthur and Julia found themselves arguing more often. The weight of unpaid bills, medical expenses for Julia, and the looming uncertainty of their future created cracks in their relationship. But through it all, Ranger remained a steady, constant presence. He could sense the unease, the stress that hung thick in the air, but he did not leave their side. Whether it was laying his head on Julia's lap as she rested or standing by Arthur as he paced the worn wooden floors, Ranger's loyalty never wavered. As the children grew older, the Whitlocks began to feel the growing distance between them. The once close family was now fragmented. Each child, eager to start their own life, drifted further away. The family dinners that had once been filled with laughter and conversation were now few and far between. The Whitlocks' once vibrant home, filled with the chatter and excitement of their children, became quieter with each passing day. Arthur and Julia couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. The children they had nurtured and sacrificed for were no longer the bright-eyed children they had once known. They were adults now, living their own lives, and slowly they stopped calling. The messages became fewer, the visits rarer, and soon Arthur and Julia were left to navigate their struggles alone with only Ranger by their side. It was during these lonely days that they realized the true meaning of Ranger's presence. He wasn't just a dog. He was the last piece of their family still there, the one being that hadn't walked away from them. As their children pursued their own paths, Ranger was the anchor that kept them grounded, the constant reminder that they were not alone. He watched over them silently, but his presence was more comforting than any words. Yet as time went on, it became clearer that the family they had once known was slipping away. Arthur and Julia felt abandoned, not just by their children, but by the world. The house, once a symbol of love and joy, now seemed like a reminder of everything they had lost. Ranger continued to offer his silent comfort, but even he seemed to understand that things were changing. His eyes, always watchful, followed Arthur and Julia as if waiting for the next chapter to begin. And for the first time, the Whitlocks knew that they could not go on living like this. As the years passed, the distance between Arthur and Julia and their children grew more pronounced. Once a close-knit family, they now found themselves at the mercy of time and changing priorities. Their children, who had once been the focus of all their energy and love, began to drift away one by one. The calls became less frequent, and the visits dwindled to nothing. The children were all adults now, building their own lives and careers, and with that came a detachment that Arthur and Julia could never have predicted. Bradford, their eldest, was the first to pull away. Once a doting son, he now seemed more concerned with his own success and his life in the city than with the aging parents who had given everything to raise him. He would come by occasionally, but his visits were brief and filled with a sense of obligation rather than love. It was a quiet betrayal that cut deeper with each passing day. Diana, the lawyer, was busy with her own career, caught up in the whirlwind of her professional life. She had no time for her parents, who seemed to her like a burden. Kevin was more concerned with his own struggles, and the others, though well-meaning, were too far away to offer any real support. Even when they did visit, it felt like an obligation, a box to check off on their list of responsibilities. The pain of being abandoned by their children was sharp, but even more painful was the silence. The family they had nurtured and sacrificed for was no longer there. The laughter that once filled their home had been replaced by long, aching silences. Arthur and Julia, once the heart of a bustling household, now found themselves alone without the children they had poured their lives into. Yet Ranger remained. His steady presence in their lives was the one thing that hadn't changed. The dog, though aging, was still there to offer them unconditional love and comfort. He never left their side. His loyalty never faltered, and for Arthur and Julia, that loyalty was the only thing that kept them from falling into despair. He was more than just a dog. He was their companion, their protector, their family. But even Ranger could not protect them from the overwhelming loneliness they felt. The house once filled with the joyful noise of children now felt like a hollow shell, a reminder of everything they had lost. The walls seemed to close in around them, and each day that passed without a call from their children deepened the sense of isolation that Arthur and Julia couldn't escape. They tried not to show it, but deep down they both knew that something had changed. They were no longer needed. They had given everything to raise their children, but now they were being left behind. Arthur felt a heavy weight on his chest, a sense of purpose slipping away. He had worked so hard for so many years, but now it all seemed meaningless. Julia, too, began to feel the weight of it all, her health failing as she struggled to breathe with every passing day. But through it all, Ranger was still there. His soft eyes, filled with understanding, followed them around the house. He would nudge Julia's hand, offer his warmth when the cold set in, and stand guard by Arthur's side. No matter how broken they felt, Ranger remained the one thing in their lives that they could count on. But even he seemed to understand that things were changing. As the silence grew louder, they could no longer ignore the truth. They had been abandoned, left behind by the very people they had sacrificed everything for. The days dragged on in a slow, painful quiet. Arthur and Julia woke up each morning to the same empty silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of their fading purpose. But nothing could have prepared them for the letter they received that day. It arrived like all the others. Plain, official, cold. But this one was different. It wasn't just another bill, another reminder of their dwindling resources. This one was a final notice. The words jumped off the page as Arthur read them aloud, his voice hoarse. "You are hereby notified that you have been evicted from your property." The house they had poured their lives into, the house they had raised 5 children in, was now no longer theirs. After 47 years of hard work, love, and sacrifice, the place that had once been a symbol of stability was now slipping away from their grasp. It felt unreal. The room seemed to spin as Arthur dropped the letter to the table, his hands trembling. Julia sat motionless, her oxygen mask on, eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to settle deeper with each passing moment. The children, once their pride and joy, had abandoned them just as the bank now was. Bradford, their eldest son, had long since cut ties. Diana had been too busy with her career to care, and the others, Kevin, Gracie, and the rest, had drifted into their own lives, leaving Arthur and Julia behind as if they were no longer relevant. They had always put their children first, sacrificing their own dreams, their own comfort for the sake of their future. But now, in their greatest time of need, their children had turned their backs. The cold reality of it hit them hard. The house was no longer theirs, and neither were the children. It felt as though they had given everything for nothing. Ranger, their ever-faithful dog, sat quietly by their side, sensing the sadness that filled the air. His presence was the only thing that still felt real. He nuzzled Julia's hand as she silently wiped away a tear, his soft brown eyes full of understanding. Arthur looked at him, his heart aching. The dog had been through it all with them, through the struggles, the victories, and the defeats. Ranger was the last piece of their family still with them. And yet, even he seemed to sense the shift in the air. He was still there, but the world around them had changed. Julia's health continued to deteriorate. The once strong woman now struggled to breathe, needing oxygen just to get through the day. Her once vibrant spirit was being drained by the cold, cruel reality of her body's decline. Arthur watched her, feeling powerless. His own sense of purpose had faded. What was left for them now? They had no family to lean on, no future to look forward to. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely adrift. It was then that the decision was made. Arthur and Julia knew they could no longer stay in this place of broken promises and forgotten love. They had to leave. Ranger had been with them through everything, and now he would be their guide once again. With little more than the clothes on their backs and Ranger by their side, they made a bold decision to leave the city behind and find a new beginning. They packed what little they could carry into their old truck and set their sights on Raven's Hollow, a remote and abandoned place deep in the Rockies. They had no idea what awaited them there, but they knew they couldn't stay in the place that had once been their home any longer. As they drove away from the life they had known, the cold mountain air seemed to offer a sense of freedom, even though their hearts were heavy. They had nothing left. No wealth, no family, no future, except Ranger and the hope of finding peace in the isolation of the mountains. As Arthur and Julia drove away from the life they had known, the weight of their decision pressed down on them. They were leaving behind everything, family memories, a lifetime of work, but they both understood that staying was no longer an option. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The city, once full of opportunities, now seemed like a reminder of everything they had lost. With nothing but the clothes on their backs and Ranger by their side, they set their sights on Raven's Hollow. It was a remote, forgotten place in the Rockies, far from the world they had known. The road ahead was uncertain, and the future seemed as empty as the truck they drove, but at least it was a chance for something new. They didn't know what awaited them, but the thought of living without the constant reminder of their failures, their abandoned dreams, and the neglect of their children gave them a flicker of hope. Ranger, as always, sat quietly beside them, his presence a comforting constant. He wasn't just a dog, he was their companion, their protector, the only family they had left. Julia reached out to stroke his head, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of his fur. There was a peace in his gaze, a trust in his loyalty that made everything seem just a little less daunting. If Ranger believed in this journey, then maybe it wasn't as foolish as it felt. The road was long, winding through unfamiliar terrain as they ascended into the mountains. The truck groaned under the strain, its engine sputtering as they climbed higher into the cold, unwelcoming peaks. The landscape around them was harsh and barren, but the silence that enveloped them felt different from the silence of the home they had just left. Here in the vastness of the Rockies, the silence was peaceful, almost soothing. It wasn't the warmth of home nor the familiarity of their old life, but it was something new, something they hadn't felt in years. It was the promise of Raven's Hollow, a place where they could start fresh away from the ghosts of their past. But even as they moved farther from the city, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the unknown, and Julia could see it in his eyes. She squeezed his hand, offering what little comfort she could. The journey was theirs together, and they would face whatever came next side by side. Ranger remained alert, his keen senses scanning the road ahead. He was more than just a passive companion. He was a protector, his instincts sharp and unwavering. Even in the quiet isolation of the mountains, Ranger's presence offered reassurance. He was guiding them in his own silent way, showing them the path to follow. They traveled for hours each mile, taking them further away from the life they once knew. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet of the road ahead. The night was cold, and the chill seemed to seep into their bones, but Arthur and Julia were determined. They had made their choice. There was no turning back now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived. Raven's Hollow stretched out before them, a desolate, forgotten place. The remnants of an old mining settlement stood in stark contrast to the snow-capped mountains surrounding it. Broken buildings, rusted equipment, and overgrown vegetation told the story of a place long abandoned. But to Arthur and Julia, it was a place of opportunity, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to reclaim what they had lost. Ranger leapt from the truck, his body alert as he surveyed their new surroundings. Unlike Arthur and Julia, who were still adjusting to the sight of this abandoned land, Ranger seemed right at home. He immediately began sniffing around his sharp nose, detecting something unseen. As always, he was ready to protect them, leading the way into this new chapter of their lives. As Arthur and Julia stepped out of the truck, the cold air greeted them, and for the first time in a long time, they felt something they hadn't in years: hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time, they realized that maybe this place, this forgotten hollow, wasn't just a refuge. It was a chance to begin again. The first light of morning revealed more of Raven's Hollow than the headlights of the truck ever could. It stretched out before them like a forgotten memory, a landscape of ruins and broken dreams. The remnants of the old mining settlement were scattered across the valley, Rusted equipment, crumbling foundations, and walls overtaken by nature. Vines crept up the sides of dilapidated structures, and the wind whispered through the cracked windows of what had once been a lively town. But to Arthur and Julia, this place wasn't a graveyard of the past. It was a blank canvas, a place where they could start anew, free from the weight of their former lives. The air was crisp and thin, but it held a promise, a quiet potential that neither of them had felt in years. They stood there for a moment, taking in the surroundings, unsure of where to begin, but certain that this was the right place for them. Ranger, as always, was ahead of them, bounding across the land as though it was all familiar. He sniffed the air, then began to methodically explore the abandoned buildings. His sharp eyes scanned the horizon, ever alert, as though protecting them from invisible threats. Julia watched as he moved with purpose, his instincts guiding him through the rubble with the grace of a dog who had been here before. In a way, Ranger was the true guide on this journey, leading them through the unknown with his unwavering loyalty and sharp senses. Arthur looked at Julia, his expression a mix of wonder and uncertainty. This place, he began, it might be more than just an escape. It could be a chance to rebuild, to find something we've lost. Julia nodded, her eyes scanning the valley. I think you're right. We came here to start over, but maybe there's more to it than that. They moved towards the center of the settlement where the old mining cabin stood. It was in worse shape than they had hoped. Half of its roof had caved in and the windows were shattered, leaving the interior exposed to the harsh elements. The walls groaned under the weight of years of neglect, but despite the damage, there was something about it that called to them. It was still standing, and that was enough to spark a glimmer of hope in their hearts. Ranger had already begun sniffing around the base of the cabin, his nose digging into the earth as if searching for something vital. He moved with determination, every movement purposeful, like a soldier on a mission. Julia watched him, the loyalty in his actions undeniable. If Ranger believed in this place, maybe they could too. They spent the rest of the day exploring the land, taking stock of what was left. There were pockets of wildflowers scattered across the valley, small signs of life among the ruins. A nearby stream flowed gently through the landscape, offering the promise of fresh water. The mountains that loomed around them, though intimidating, also offered a sense of protection, as though they were being embraced by the very earth they stood on. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Arthur and Julia sat on a fallen log, watching Ranger as he continued to patrol the area. The dog had not just found his place here, he had claimed it, and in a way he was teaching them to do the same. "This could be our home," Arthur said softly, looking at the fading light. "It's not much, but maybe it's enough to start over." Julia nodded again, her heart swelling with a sense of determination. "We can make it enough. We'll fix the house, clean up the land, and take it one step at a time." And so in the fading light of that first day, Arthur and Julia knew they had found their new beginning. They might not have everything they needed, but they had each other, Ranger, and the land that promised something more than they had hoped for. The morning after their arrival, Arthur and Julia set to work immediately. The abandoned cabin, though a promising shelter, was in dire condition. The roof was caved in at one end, and the walls sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Windows were shattered, leaving gaps that allowed the biting mountain wind to rush through. The floor, covered in dust and debris, was uneven and cracked. With only the basics in their truck and Ranger as their companion, they didn't have much to work with. But they had each other, and that had to be enough. Arthur began clearing out the debris from the collapsed side of the cabin, while Julia focused on the small tasks that needed to be done inside. There was no shortage of work, and every day felt like a battle against the elements. But Ranger was a constant source of help and reassurance. He sniffed around the cabin, then moved on to patrol the perimeter, his keen instincts always on alert. While Arthur and Julia worked tirelessly to fix what they could, the dog kept watch, making sure nothing threatened their safety. Even in the silence of the mountains, his presence was a reminder that they were not alone. The first few days were grueling. Their hands were raw from the work, and their backs ached from the constant labor. They had to make do with what little they had, using scavenged materials to patch up the worst parts of the cabin. Arthur had a knack for fixing things, a skill honed from years of working in the factory. Julia, despite her failing health, found a new sense of purpose in keeping the place organized and setting up what little comfort she could inside. As the days passed, they began to notice small improvements. The cabin, while still far from perfect, was becoming livable. The cracks in the walls were patched, and a small fire crackled in the stove, warming the cold, empty space. Ranger continued to patrol the area, but now he would settle by their side when they took breaks, always watchful, but also offering a sense of peace that made the harsh conditions more bearable. Through the exhaustion, a quiet understanding began to develop between Arthur and Julia. The strain of the last few years, the pain of abandonment by their children, and the difficulties of their health seemed to lift just slightly with each task they completed. They began to talk more, to reminisce about the past, and to share their hopes for the future. The silence that had once settled between them was gradually replaced with conversation, and the distance that had grown over the years started to close. Ranger, as always, remained a silent but ever-present witness to their struggles and progress. He had always been loyal, but here in the isolation of the mountains, his loyalty felt more significant. He had guided them to this place, and now he watched over them with a quiet vigilance, as if he knew this was the place where their healing could begin. Arthur wiped the sweat from his brow and looked around. The cabin was far from perfect, but it was their home now. The land surrounding them was harsh and unforgiving, but it also held a certain beauty. Wild, untamed, but full of life. They had no illusions about the hard road ahead, but for the first time in a long time they felt the spark of something new. "We're doing it," Arthur said, his voice soft but steady. "We're making this work." Julia smiled weakly, her face tired but filled with a quiet determination. "We're doing it together." As they looked around at the small progress they had made, they realized that this was only the beginning. There was much more to be done, but they had something they hadn't had in years, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. Ranger sat quietly between them, his presence a steady reminder that no matter how tough the road ahead, they would face it together. Each day in Raven's Hollow was a challenge, but also a discovery. Arthur and Julia had no choice but to learn how to survive on their own, far removed from the comforts of city life. The land was harsh, unforgiving, and often cold, but it also held a wild beauty that neither of them had ever truly appreciated until now. The mountains stood like silent sentinels around them, their peaks draped in snow, while the valley below was filled with the sound of rustling trees and the occasional call of wildlife. They began to rely more on the land for their survival, learning how to gather firewood, forage for food, and make do with what little they had. Arthur used his mechanical skills to repair the truck enough to keep it running, and Julia began planting a small garden using the fertile soil they found near the stream. They were starting from scratch, but slowly they were building a life again. Ranger was their constant companion, always by their side, helping them in ways they couldn't have imagined. He would lead them through the rough terrain, guiding them to safe places to gather food and water. His keen nose and sharp instincts were invaluable. He seemed to know where to find the most nourishing plants and how to navigate the dangerous rocky slopes of the mountains. One day, as they were exploring the outskirts of the settlement, Ranger led them to a secluded area hidden among the trees. At first, Arthur and Julia thought it was just another part of the forest, but as they moved closer, they discovered a small, bubbling spring. The water was crystal clear, the kind of pure water that seemed to call to them. But it wasn't just the water's clarity that caught their attention, it was the warmth. The water was warm, almost hot, and it smelled faintly of minerals, a scent that filled the air with something almost healing. Ranger was already kneeling by the water, his nose touching the surface, then looking up at them with a satisfied expression. Arthur and Julia exchanged glances. Could this be another miracle of Raven's Hollow? They knelt down beside the spring, dipping their hands into the water. It was soothing to the touch, like a gentle embrace from nature itself. Julia, still struggling with her health, hesitated for a moment before dipping her hands into the water. Her fingers tingled as the warmth spread through her veins, calming the tightness in her chest. It wasn't just the comfort of the water, it felt like something deeper was happening, as if the very essence of the earth was reaching inside her and easing the pain that had long since become a part of her. For the first time in weeks, Julia felt her breath deep in her lungs, filling more easily with each inhale. The oxygen tank she had grown so dependent on seemed less and less necessary. She closed her eyes, feeling a wave of relief wash over her, a sensation she hadn't experienced in a long time. Arthur watched her closely, his heart swelling with a quiet hope. Could this water be the key to healing her? The thought seemed impossible, but the change in Julia was undeniable. The tightness in her chest had eased, and she was breathing easier than she had in months. As they continued to soak their hands in the warm, mineral-rich water, Ranger kept watch, his body alert as ever. He had found this place, and he seemed to know instinctively that it held something special. It was as if he had led them here not just to survive, but to heal. With Ranger by their side and the discovery of this natural spring, Arthur and Julia began to feel a sense of peace that had long eluded them. They didn't know how they would make it through the next few weeks, but for the first time since they had arrived, they felt that perhaps, just perhaps, they were on the right path. They gathered what little they could carry from the spring, some of the warm water in their canisters, and made their way back to the cabin, eager to see if the spring's healing power would continue to work for Julia. As they walked, Arthur couldn't help but think that this place, this mountain, had become more than just a refuge. It was a second chance, a place where they could heal, rebuild, and reclaim what they had lost. Over the following days, Julia continued to visit the spring, each time immersing her hands in the warm, mineral-rich water. The first few soaks brought her a sense of calm, but it wasn't until the third or fourth day that she truly began to notice a change. The tightness in her chest, the labored breathing that had become so familiar, was starting to ease. The air, which had once felt so thin and suffocating, now felt easier to breathe in. The weight that had always rested heavily on her chest was lifting bit by bit. She no longer reached for the oxygen tank the moment she woke up in the morning. It felt strange at first, but the difference was undeniable. Each breath came more freely, more naturally. The air seemed to fill her lungs completely without the struggle that had plagued her for so long. Julia was cautious, unsure if this was just temporary relief or a true healing process, but the improvement was too significant to ignore. One evening, as Arthur sat beside her watching the sun set over the mountains, he noticed the change too. Julia wasn't using the oxygen tank, and her face, usually pale and drawn, now looked healthier, rosier, more alive. Her eyes, once clouded with fatigue and pain, now sparkled with renewed energy. "You're better," Arthur said softly, his voice filled with wonder. Julia smiled, a lightness in her expression that hadn't been there in months. "I think I am," she replied, her voice stronger than it had been in a long time. "The water. It's helping, I can feel it." Each day brought more improvement. The effects were subtle at first. Just a little more strength in her legs, a little more clarity in her mind, but they were real. By the end of the week, Julia found herself walking farther and faster than she had in months without the need for rest or breaks. She could even take short walks outside around the cabin and beyond, feeling the mountain air fill her lungs without the familiar pain. As for Arthur, he wasn't immune to the healing effects of the spring. While his improvement wasn't as dramatic as Julia's, he began to notice a difference. His joints, which had always ached, particularly in the cold, felt looser, less stiff. The constant discomfort in his knees and back, which had been his companions for years, seemed to ease as he continued to soak in the water each morning and evening. He didn't feel as burdened as he once had. His body felt lighter, more mobile, and for the first time in a long while, his mind felt clearer, less clouded by the weight of worry. Ranger, ever the vigilant guardian, seemed to thrive in the new environment as well. His coat grew shinier, his movements more energetic. It was as if the energy of the land had seeped into him too, giving him an extra spark of life. He was, as always, the one leading the way. Whether he was protecting the cabin, patrolling the land, or simply offering his quiet companionship, Ranger seemed to sense the healing taking place and was more present than ever. For Arthur and Julia, the days spent in Raven's Hollow were more than just about surviving. They were about thriving. The land, once harsh and barren, now felt like a refuge. The water, which had seemed so unremarkable at first, was now a life-saving force, offering them the healing they had so desperately needed. And just as Arthur and Julia were beginning to feel the full extent of the changes happening in their lives, Ranger led them to something new, something that would change everything. One crisp morning, as Arthur and Julia made their way to the stream for their daily soak, Ranger led them toward the old mining cabin. He trotted ahead, his sharp eyes scanning every corner and his nose to the ground as he sniffed the air. It was clear that he had found something. Arthur and Julia exchanged curious glances, but they trusted their dog's instincts and followed him into the cabin. They had been living in the settlement for weeks now, and though they had made progress in restoring the cabin and adjusting to their new life, there were still many unanswered questions. The history of this place remained a mystery, and Arthur had begun to wonder if there was more to Raven's Hollow than just its natural beauty and its healing waters. As they entered the cabin, Ranger stopped in front of a hidden door half covered by dust and debris. He pawed at it gently, then stepped back, looking up at Arthur and Julia as if to say, "This is the place." Arthur hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and wood, but there was something inviting about the space, as though it had been waiting for them all along. The room was sparse, but in the corner Arthur spotted a weathered wooden box. He crouched down and carefully opened it. Inside there was an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. As Arthur flipped through the pages, his heart began to race. The journal belonged to Emmett Whitlock, his grandfather. The entries revealed that Emmett had spent many years in Raven's Hollow using the land and its resources to treat various ailments for those who came to him. It seemed that the water they had discovered was not just a gift of nature. It had been used for generations as a source of healing. Julia leaned over Arthur's shoulder, her eyes scanning the words. The journal described how the healing properties of the water had been passed down through the family, with each generation learning to harness its potential. Emmett had treated a wide range of conditions from joint pain to respiratory issues and even more severe ailments. The water, rich in minerals and warmth, had been used for centuries to soothe and heal. The journal contained detailed instructions on how to use the water for various conditions, as well as notes on the different springs in the area. There was a spring for respiratory ailments, another for joint pain, and even one for skin conditions. Arthur and Julia exchanged a glance, both of them realizing that what they had discovered in this valley was more significant than they had ever imagined. As they read further, they learned that Emmett had dedicated his life to keeping the healing properties of the springs a secret, protecting them from exploitation. His final entry, written just before his passing, read, "The land knows what is needed. The water heals in its own time, and when the world is ready, it will be shared again." The weight of Emmett's words hung in the air as Arthur and Julia processed what they had just uncovered. It seemed that they were not the first to discover the miraculous properties of the water, but they were the first in a long time to truly understand its importance. Ranger, who had been quietly sitting at their feet, looked up at them, his eyes filled with understanding, as if he knew the significance of this moment. For Arthur and Julia, this discovery marked a turning point. They had come to Raven's Hollow seeking peace, but now they understood that they had found something far more powerful, something that could change not just their lives, but the lives of others as well. With the discovery of Emmett Whitlock's journal, Arthur and Julia found themselves standing at the precipice of something much greater than they had ever imagined. The days following their discovery were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew they couldn't keep the healing powers of the springs to themselves, not when there was so much potential to help others, just as Emmett had done in the past. Arthur rolled up his sleeves and got to work immediately. The cabin needed more than just repairs. It needed to be a place where people could come and find relief. His years of experience working with tools and machines now served him well, as he set about making the cabin livable, not just for him and Julia, but for those who might one day come seeking healing. The land, too, needed attention. Julia began to clear out sections of the overgrown vegetation, allowing the healing springs to breathe, to be seen, and to be accessible once again. Together, they worked tirelessly to restore the area. Ranger, ever the loyal companion, was never far behind. He continued his rounds around the cabin and the land, ensuring everything was safe, and as they worked, He was there to guide them, sniffing out new paths, discovering hidden treasures that might be useful, and guarding them from the wildlife that roamed the area. His sharp instincts were invaluable. Nothing escaped his notice. As the weeks passed, Arthur and Julia began to notice changes not just in the land, but in themselves. They were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. They were building something meaningful. The simple act of working together side by side in a place that felt as though it had been waiting for them all along began to heal the wounds they had carried for so long. The strain that had existed in their relationship from years of sacrifice and stress began to fade. They spoke more, shared their dreams, and laughed together in ways they hadn't in years. Ranger became more than just their companion. He became the heart of their new life. With each passing day, the bond between them deepened. He wasn't just protecting them, he was guiding them, showing them how to trust in the land, in each other, and in themselves. The days of isolation, of feeling abandoned and forgotten, were fading into the past. Ranger had led them to a place of peace, and now he was helping them build that peace into something lasting. As the spring water continued to flow, so did the sense of peace that it brought into their lives. Julia, feeling stronger each day, began to document her experiences with the water and its healing effects. She noticed that not only had her physical health improved, but her spirit had been revived as well. The sense of purpose she had lost so many years ago was returning. She was no longer just caring for the land and for Arthur. She was helping to preserve something that could help others, something that could heal. For the first time in a long time, Arthur and Julia were not just existing. They were living, truly living. The work they were doing was more than just a means of survival. It was a way of reclaiming the joy they had lost. And as they continued to restore Raven's Hollow, they began to see signs of a different kind of healing taking place, not just in their bodies, but in their hearts. Their quiet, humble life in the mountains was beginning to feel more like a home than they had ever imagined possible. And with Ranger always by their side, they knew that they had finally found the place where they could truly begin again. As the days passed in Raven's Hollow, Arthur and Julia found themselves becoming stronger, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. The once heavy burden of illness and despair seemed to lift piece by piece like a dark fog dissipating with the dawn. Julia's health had shown remarkable improvement. Her breath, which had once been shallow and labored, was now deeper and steadier. The constant struggle she had fought for so long had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of vitality that felt almost foreign but deeply welcome. It wasn't just her physical body that was healing. Julia felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. She had spent so many years caring for others, but now she realized that in this quiet place she was finally able to care for herself. The spring water with its healing properties had revived her body, but it was the land, the isolation, and the work of rebuilding their life that had revived her spirit. In the evenings after a long day of work, Julia would sit with a notebook and pen, carefully documenting her experiences with the springs and their effects. She started to notice patterns in the way the water healed. She wrote about how the water seemed to ease her breathing, how it helped her muscles relax, and even how it lifted her mood when the weight of the world had once pressed so heavily on her. Arthur would read over her shoulder from time to time, proud of the work she was doing. It was more than just keeping records. It was a form of healing for her, an act of reclaiming control over a life that had often felt out of her hands. The work they were doing in Raven's Hollow was no longer just about survival. It had become something far greater, a way of living, of thriving. The physical labor had started to feel rewarding, not just tiring. They were breathing life back into the cabin, back into the land, and back into themselves. Each nail they hammered, each stone they placed, each seed they planted felt like a piece of their old selves returning. But it wasn't just Arthur and Julia who were finding renewal. Ranger, their ever-faithful companion, had become a symbol of hope and resilience. His loyalty had always been unwavering, but now he embodied the spirit of their new life. He had led them here to Raven's Hollow, and now he was showing them how to rebuild, how to survive, and how to heal. His steady presence was a reminder that even in the most difficult times, there was always a way forward, always a light in the darkness. To Arthur and Julia, Ranger had become the key that unlocked the door to their healing. His companionship was more than just comfort, it was a lifeline. He didn't just protect them from physical danger, he protected their hearts, reminding them that they were still worth something, still capable of living fully. Each day, as the sun rose over the mountain, they were reminded that their story was not over. They had faced loss, abandonment, and hardship, but they had found a new beginning. Ranger had led them to this place, but it was their love for each other, their willingness to rebuild, and their faith in the healing power of the land that was carrying them forward. The weeks spent in Raven's Hollow had brought a quiet peace into Arthur and Julia's lives, a peace that was both earned and fragile. They had begun to rebuild not just the cabin, but also their relationship with each other. The land had become their sanctuary, a place to heal and find purpose again. But their quiet existence was soon interrupted by an unexpected visit, one they had never anticipated. It was Bradford, their eldest son, who first made contact. After hearing rumors from locals about the miraculous healing springs and the transformation of Raven's Hollow, he and his siblings had decided to visit. It was a surprise to Arthur and Julia, who hadn't heard from their children in months, if not longer. But their hearts were heavy with a mix of hope and apprehension. Would this be the chance to reconnect, to repair the rift that had formed between them? When Bradford and the others arrived, it wasn't the joyful reunion they had once dreamed of. The weathered truck that pulled into the clearing was filled with their children, Bradford at the wheel, followed by Diana, Kevin, and Gracie. For a brief moment, the air seemed to crackle with the tension of unspoken words. Arthur and Julia stood in the doorway of the cabin watching them approach. They hadn't expected to feel so distant from their own flesh and blood, but they did. The years of abandonment had left deep scars, and now, standing face to face with the children who had chosen to leave them behind, those scars felt fresh. "Mom, Dad." Bradford began, his voice faltering slightly as he took in the sight of their transformed lives. "We've heard about what's been happening here, about the springs. We wanted to see it for ourselves." Julia remained silent, her hands clasped tightly together, her expression unreadable. Arthur, standing beside her, crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze steady but cold. Ranger, who had been sitting quietly by their feet, stood up, his stance protective. He had always been the one to sense what was needed in moments like this, and today was no different. The dog watched Bradford and the others with cautious eyes, as though assessing their intentions. Diana stepped forward, her legal portfolio tucked under her arm. "We've heard rumors," she said, her voice professional, almost distant, "that the springs here have healing properties. People are calling it a miracle." Arthur finally spoke, his voice low and firm. "Miracle. You think this is a miracle, Diana?" His words hung in the air. "You think you can just walk back into our lives and call it a miracle?" The tension in the air was palpable. Julia's eyes flickered with emotion, but she remained silent, her mind swirling with the weight of the past. Their children, once the center of their world, had abandoned them when they needed them most. Now they were back, not to offer help, but to investigate a potential opportunity. Arthur felt the sting of betrayal all over again, and this time the hurt was too deep to ignore. Bradford shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, we didn't know what to expect, but we heard that things have changed here, that this place might be valuable." A quiet laugh escaped Julia, bitter and soft. "Valuable," she repeated. "Is that what you think this is, a place to make money?" Kevin looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that hung over the conversation. Gracie, however, wasn't hiding her distaste. "This place, it's all so different. So much better than when we left you two behind," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Ranger growled lowly, a warning to the intruders in his own way. It was as though he could sense the growing animosity and was prepared to defend his family from the hurt they had long endured. Arthur reached down, his hand resting on Ranger's back, offering him comfort in return. The dog was just as protective of them as ever, but this time the protectiveness extended beyond physical safety. It was about safeguarding their hearts, too. The conversation turned tense, with accusations and half-hearted apologies thrown about. Bradford seemed to want to repair things, but Arthur and Julia were too weary to believe in easy words. They had been left behind when they had nothing left to give, and now it seemed their children had returned because there was something of value to be gained. The visit was short, and when it ended, Arthur and Julia found themselves once again standing in the quiet of Raven's Hollow, their hearts heavy with the realization that nothing had really changed. The children who had walked away were now back, but their motives felt wrong. They hadn't come to reconnect with their parents, but to find something they could use. As the children left, Ranger sat by the cabin door watching them disappear into the distance. His eyes filled with understanding never left their backs until they were out of sight. He had always been their protector, and once again he showed them that sometimes family was not always the one you were born into. Sometimes it was the one you chose, the ones who stood by you through thick and thin. The days following the departure of Bradford and the others were quiet. The tension left behind by the visit still lingered, but Arthur and Julia carried on focusing on the work that needed to be done. The land was still a place of peace and healing for them, but the wounds left by their children's abandonment were not so easily forgotten. Yet, as always, Ranger remained at their side, a steadfast presence in their lives, offering silent comfort and protection. But the calm they had grown accustomed to was shattered one evening when a storm rolled in. The mountains, once a serene and protective presence, now appeared ominous. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, blotting out the sun and filling the sky with an unnatural heaviness. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a deep, unsettling chill. Arthur and Julia had grown used to the mountain weather, but this was different. The wind picked up speed, and the temperature plummeted in a way that felt threatening. The distant sound of thunder rumbled through the valley, and Arthur's instincts kicked in. They needed to prepare. Ranger, who had been silently watching the skies, suddenly stood up, his body stiffening. His ears were alert, and his eyes were fixed on the mountainside, scanning the horizon. Arthur and Julia exchanged a glance. Something wasn't right. They had seen Ranger react this way before, but it was always a sign of impending danger. Without hesitation, Arthur grabbed Julia's hand and led her towards the cabin. The wind began to pick up, tearing through the trees with a fury that was impossible to ignore. As the first heavy raindrops began to fall, Ranger bolted ahead, running toward the base of the mountain. He stopped, turned around, and barked sharply as if to say, "Follow me." Julia, her chest still weak, struggled to keep up, but Arthur remained close to her, urging her forward. Ranger continued to lead them, his nose to the ground, tail stiff with focus. They hadn't seen him act this urgently before. The storm was coming fast, and it wasn't just a storm. It was a threat. They followed Ranger up the winding path towards the higher ground where they could escape the worst of the floodwaters. The rain began to fall in sheets, the wind howling like a wild beast, tearing at the trees and making it hard to see. Ranger was a blur in front of them, weaving through the heavy downpour, leading them to safety with an unshakable sense of certainty. Suddenly, Arthur stopped. The ground beneath him was softening, the earth beginning to give way. He realized too late that the rising water was closing in on them. The rain, relentless and furious, was causing the streams to swell rapidly, and they were now at risk of being caught in a flash flood. But before panic could set in, Ranger returned to them, barking frantically, urging them forward. He leapt through the muddy ground, his body moving with purpose. Arthur and Julia rushed to follow, barely staying ahead of the rising tide. The path became treacherous, and the weight of the storm bore down on them with terrifying force. Ranger led them to higher ground, guiding them to an overhang just as the floodwaters surged behind them, threatening to swallow the path they had just traversed. They barely made it, but they were safe. For now. Ranger stood between them and the rising flood, watching the water rush past them. He remained alert, never once turning his gaze from the danger below. The storm continued to rage, but Arthur and Julia had found a momentary refuge. They were safe, thanks to Ranger, whose instincts and loyalty had once again saved them from a peril they could not have faced alone. As they huddled together waiting for the storm to pass, they realized something profound. Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was their protector, their guide, and their lifeline. Without him, They would have been lost in the chaos of the storm, swept away by forces they could not control. He had led them to safety, and now more than ever Arthur and Julia knew that they owed him everything. When the storm finally passed, leaving the land covered in a blanket of wet silence, Arthur and Julia knew that they had faced something far beyond their control. The floodwaters, though receding, had left behind a trail of destruction, but they were alive, safe, and Ranger had once again proven his worth, guiding them through the storm to safety. As they sat huddled together on the high ground, still shaken from the terror of the flash flood, the sound of an engine reached their ears. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the remnants of the storm, but amidst the calm that followed, Arthur and Julia exchanged a look. There was only one possible reason for anyone to be out here in the aftermath of such a fierce storm. Their children were back. Bradford was the first to appear, stepping out of the truck, his clothes damp from the storm. His usual air of control seemed less certain now, and as he approached his parents, there was something different in his expression, something that had been absent the last time they had seen him. "Mom, Dad," he began, his voice softer than usual. We heard about the storm. We couldn't just leave you out here like this." Behind him, Diana, Kevin, and Gracie followed, looking hesitant but determined. The sight of their children standing together in the aftermath of a storm felt almost surreal to Arthur and Julia. For months, they had been left to fend for themselves, only to now be confronted with this unexpected but welcome reunion. Despite the relief of seeing them again, Arthur and Julia remained cautious. The wounds of the past were still fresh, the abandonment still a bitter taste in their mouths. They had given everything for their children, but now as they stood there together, they realized that things had changed. Bradford seemed to sense the tension in the air. "I'm sorry, Mom, Dad," he said quietly, his eyes meeting theirs. "We didn't know what we were doing. We've been so caught up in our own lives we didn't see what was really important." The apology felt sincere, but Arthur and Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they had been forgotten in the rush of their children's ambitions. Diana, who had been the least involved in their lives, stepped forward next, her expression more open than it had ever been. "We've been wrong," she said, her voice carrying a weight of realization. "All this time, we didn't understand what you two were going through. We didn't see how much you had sacrificed for us. We didn't appreciate you or Ranger." At the mention of Ranger, the dog stood up, moving to stand next to Arthur and Julia, his presence commanding the attention of everyone present. He looked at Bradford and the others, his sharp eyes taking in their every movement. Kevin stepped forward, his gaze softer than usual. We had no idea what you two were really doing here," he admitted. "But seeing Ranger, seeing what he's done for you, makes me realize how much we missed, how much we lost." For the first time in what felt like years, Arthur and Julia felt the distance between them and their children begin to shrink. The years of bitterness and resentment were not gone, but this moment, their children acknowledging their sacrifices, was a start. The changes in Ranger, too, had started to shift the atmosphere. He wasn't just the family dog, he was a bridge connecting the family in a way no words could. The reunion wasn't immediate or easy, but as the day stretched on, Arthur and Julia slowly opened their hearts again. They realized that the love they had for their children had never wavered, and now perhaps their children could finally understand the depth of that love, the sacrifices made and the loyalty they had shown all these years. As the day turned to evening, Bradford and his siblings helped Arthur and Julia with the repairs needed in the aftermath of the storm. There were still many tasks to be done, but this moment of their family coming together felt like the beginning of something new. Arthur and Julia finally felt that their family was whole again, even if it had taken a storm to bring them back together. In the days that followed the storm, Ranger became not just a protector, but the soul of Raven's Hollow. He had led Arthur and Julia through their darkest times, and now he stood as a bridge between the past and the future. Ranger was more than a dog. He was the keeper of the land, the silent guardian who watched over the family, offering them strength when they had none left. The family's reunion had opened old wounds, but it had also begun the healing process. As Bradford, Diana, Kevin, and Gracie helped with the repairs, the air between them and Arthur and Julia was less tense. There was an unspoken understanding now. The children who had once abandoned their parents began to see the depth of their sacrifices and the strength it had taken for Arthur and Julia to survive without them. Arthur and Julia knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were finally ready to face the truth. Their children's return wasn't a magic fix for the years of abandonment, but it was a chance to rebuild what had been broken. The family, though scarred, had been given a new opportunity to reconnect, and Ranger in his quiet way had led them to this moment. The bond between the family members was fragile, but it was there. Each of them in their own way had begun to understand what it meant to love and forgive. Arthur and Julia knew that it wasn't enough to just rebuild the cabin or restore the land. They needed to restore the trust, the love, and the family that had been lost over the years. That night, as they gathered around the fire, the weight of the past still hung heavily on Arthur and Julia's hearts, but the presence of their children working alongside them felt like a small victory. Ranger, ever the vigilant protector, lay at their feet, watching over them as he always had, as if guarding the hope that had begun to blossom once again. Arthur looked at his children, his heart full of emotions he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't erase the past, nor could he forget the hurt they had caused, but he had come to realize that forgiveness was a process, a journey just like the one they had begun in Raven's Hollow. He could see the change in their faces, the shift in their hearts. They had come back not just to repair a house, but to rebuild their family. "I know we can't go back," Arthur said quietly, his voice rough from emotion. "But maybe we can start something new here, for all of us." Julia nodded, her hand resting on Ranger's head. "This place, this land, it has a way of healing. I think it can help us all." The conversation paused for a moment, and they all looked at Ranger, who was lying contentedly by the fire, his head resting on his paws. Ranger had been the constant through it all, and through the years of hardship, the isolation, and the pain. And now, as the family faced the truth of what had happened, Ranger was the symbol of everything they had lost and everything they could still gain. Arthur and Julia knew that Raven's Hollow was more than just a place. It was their chance to rebuild, to heal physically, emotionally, and spiritually. They had been given a gift, and they were determined to protect it. Together, they would not only create a home, but a sanctuary, a place where healing could happen not just for them, but for anyone who needed it. It would take hard work, dedication, and time, but Arthur and Julia were ready, and this time they would not be doing it alone. The following days were filled with a quiet, unspoken understanding. The tension that had lingered between Arthur, Julia, and their children had begun to fade, replaced by something deeper, something more fragile but also more profound. Bradford, Diana. Kevin and Gracie were still coming to terms with the past, but they had finally started to see what Arthur and Julia had built in Raven's Hollow. A life not just of survival, but of renewal. Sitting around the fire sharing stories from their past, the Whitlock family began to reconnect. The children who had once walked away, each of them carrying their own burdens of pride, guilt, and misunderstandings, now found themselves in the presence of something that transcended those wounds, the simple, unspoken truth of love. Ranger, lying at their feet, seemed to represent that truth perfectly. He had remained steadfast, loyal, and constant while their human relationships had faltered. Bradford was the first to speak, his voice breaking through the silence. "I never understood it," he said, looking down at Ranger. I thought you were just an old dog, Dad. But now I see. You weren't just keeping the house warm, you were keeping the family together." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Arthur didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at Julia, who gave him a small, knowing smile. They had spent so many years giving everything they had to their children, only to be cast aside when their children had their own lives to lead. But now, in the quiet of Raven's Hollow, they were beginning to understand that the love they had given was never truly lost. It had simply been waiting to be rediscovered. Julia, with a softness that had been absent in their previous conversations, spoke next. "We didn't want to leave you behind, you know. But we had to. We needed to find a way to heal too. Not just physically, but in our hearts. Diana, who had been quieter than usual, met Julia's gaze. Her eyes filled with a newfound understanding. I've been so wrapped up in my own life and my own career that I forgot what really matters. Coming here, seeing how you've rebuilt everything, I realize now that the things I thought I needed were never what I truly wanted. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the Whitlock family sat together in silence, not out of discomfort, but out of a deep mutual respect. They had all changed. Arthur, Julia, and their children had spent years apart, but now they were finally beginning to see the value of the sacrifices they had all made and the lessons they could learn from one another. The days that followed the storm brought about a transformation in the family. The children, once unsure of their place in their parents' lives, now recognized that Ravens Hollow was more than just a remote location. It was a symbol of what they could rebuild together. A place where love could thrive again, where forgiveness could begin, and where the wounds of the past could start to heal. As they worked together, the bond between Arthur, Julia, and their children grew stronger. They weren't just repairing a cabin or restoring the land, they were healing old wounds, rediscovering lost connections, and finding a new way forward as a family. The change wasn't sudden, nor was it easy. There were still moments of tension, of uncertainty, and of old habits creeping back in. But the family had found a foundation for their new life in Ravens Hollow. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, they had hope. For the future, for their relationships, and for the healing that had already begun. As Arthur, Julia, and their children worked together to restore Ravens Hollow, something remarkable began to take shape. Something they hadn't anticipated. Ravens Hollow was no longer just a retreat for their family. It had transformed into a symbol of healing, not just physically, but spiritually. The family's bond grew stronger as they labored side by side, breathing life back into a place that had once been abandoned. And in that process, they realized that their work here wasn't just about them, it was about something much bigger. Ranger continued to be the heart of their journey. He was not just a companion, but a guide showing them the way, not just through the rugged terrain of the mountains, but through the healing process itself. His actions instinctively protecting and leading were a constant reminder of what true loyalty and selflessness meant. In his quiet, steadfast way, he had taught them the importance of connection and care, not just for their family, but for the land they had come to call home. As the months passed, Arthur and Julia realized that their dream of creating a sanctuary for healing could extend beyond their family. The healing properties of the land, the springs that had worked wonders for them, could help others too. They had always believed in the power of community, how the bonds between people could uplift and support one another. Now in Ravens Hollow, they had the opportunity to create that community, but it had to be done responsibly. They had learned through their own experiences that rushing into things could lead to mistakes. They would need to be thoughtful about how they shared this gift with the world. Diana, ever the practical one, was the first to suggest that they begin to open Ravens Hollow to a broader community. We have something here that could help so many people, but we need to make sure it's sustainable. We need to create a plan to protect the land, to protect the springs. It can't just be about turning this into a business. It has to be about healing. True healing. Kevin agreed, though his usual hesitancy was now replaced by a drive to make it work. We can't just let people come and go without structure, he said. This place has potential, but it needs careful management. We need to make sure the land is respected. Arthur and Julia understood the importance of their children's advice. They had worked tirelessly to restore their own connection, and now they could see that this land, this place, had the potential to heal others as well. They had the space to welcome people in need, people who could benefit from the healing springs and the peaceful surroundings. But it had to be done in a way that honored the land, the legacy of Emmett Whitlock, and the work that had been put into creating the sanctuary. With Ranger leading the way, the family set about making their vision a reality. They began to plan for small groups of people to visit, ensuring that there was a careful balance between providing healing and maintaining the integrity of the land. They worked to create sustainable accommodations, making sure that the infrastructure was built with respect for the environment and the people it served. As Ravens Hollow began to take shape as a sanctuary for healing, the community around them began to grow. Locals, seeing the change in Arthur and Julia, came to them for guidance. They offered help, whether it was in the form of materials, labor, or support. The word of Raven's Hollow began to spread, and soon people from neighboring towns were making the journey to see the healing springs for themselves. This new phase of their life, building a community, helping others, and expanding their vision, felt right. They were no longer alone, and neither was the land. The connection between Arthur, Julia, their children, and Ranger had created a ripple effect that reached far beyond their family. The healing that had begun with them had spread, touching those around them and giving them a sense of purpose they hadn't known before. But as they looked to the future, Arthur and Julia knew that the time would come when they would have to make a decision. A decision that would define the future of Raven's Hollow and their family's legacy. As Raven's Hollow flourished, the Whitlock family found themselves at a crossroads. They had worked tirelessly to transform the land into a sanctuary, not just for themselves, but for others in need of healing. The healing springs, the peaceful atmosphere, and the hard work of restoring the cabin had not only given them back their health, but also their sense of purpose. They had built something beautiful, something lasting, and the people who came to visit could feel it too. The community around them was growing, and with each passing day, more people came to see the springs, bringing with them their own hopes and healing needs. Arthur, Julia, and their children had created a space where people could reconnect with nature and find relief from their own struggles. But as the visits increased, so did the challenges. The delicate balance between offering healing to those in need and protecting the land that had given them so much was becoming harder to maintain. One evening, as they sat around the fire after a long day of work, the conversation took a serious turn. Bradford, the eldest, was the first to speak. "We've built something incredible here. But how long can we keep this up? People keep coming, and there's more demand than we can handle." Julia nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that too. We want to help as many people as we can, but we can't lose sight of why we came here in the first place." Arthur sighed, his mind heavy with the weight of the decision. "We've done so much already, but it's not just about expanding the sanctuary. We have to protect what we've built. We can't let the place become something it wasn't meant to be." Diana, ever the logical one, added, "The foundation is strong now, but what happens when we're not here to maintain it? What happens if the demand outpaces our ability to manage it?" Ranger, who had been lying quietly by the fire, lifted his head and looked around at the family. His presence was steady and unwavering as always, and in his eyes Arthur saw the quiet wisdom of the land. The same wisdom that had led them here in the first place. The family sat in silence for a long while, each person lost in their thoughts. Arthur and Julia had always believed that the healing of Raven's Hollow was meant to be shared, but now they were realizing that with this gift came great responsibility. The land, the water, the space. They all needed to be protected, and the family needed to decide how to preserve the integrity of what they had worked so hard to create. After much deliberation, Arthur spoke, his voice quiet, but filled with conviction. "We need to find a way to open Raven's Hollow to the right people, but in a way that keeps it safe. We can't let it become something that loses its meaning or becomes a commercial venture. We came here to heal, not to make money." Julia reached for Arthur's hand, a smile tugging at her lips. "We can make it work, Arthur. We'll create something that balances the healing with the need for preservation. But we have to do it carefully. This place is special. It has given us so much." They all agreed, knowing that their decision wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would require careful planning, hard work, and the same dedication they had put into restoring the land. But they also knew that Raven's Hollow had the potential to change the lives of many, not just their own. They would find a way to protect its sanctity while allowing others to benefit from its healing. As the weeks turned into months, Arthur and Julia continued to work alongside their children, slowly transforming Raven's Hollow into something beyond their wildest dreams. A place of healing, peace, and renewal. It was a new chapter, one they hadn't anticipated but were grateful for nonetheless. The land once barren and forgotten had become their sanctuary, a haven for the body and soul. And with Ranger ever by their side, they knew they had found something truly special. The decision they had made, to protect Raven's Hollow and share it with others, but in a way that preserved its purity, wasn't easy. They didn't want to commercialize it to turn it into something that lost its meaning. But they had also come to realize that the gift of healing they had found was not something to be hoarded. It needed to be shared, but carefully. They would build a community not around profit, but around love, kindness, and healing. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur and Julia felt a deep sense of purpose, a sense that they were doing something right, something that mattered. Every day as they worked together, Ranger remained their constant guide. The dog had been their protector, their companion, and their lifeline through the darkest moments of their lives. But now he had become more than that. Ranger was a symbol, a living embodiment of the love and loyalty that had carried them through their struggles. He was proof that even in the most difficult times, there was always hope. His unshakable faith in them, his unwavering dedication, had been the anchor they needed to rebuild their lives. Arthur and Julia often found themselves sitting by the fire in the evenings reflecting on how far they had come. They had found their home, their peace, and a sense of purpose that had been absent for so many years. They had lost so much, but in the end they had gained more than they ever could have imagined. Ravens Hollow wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing testament to resilience, to healing, and to the power of love and loyalty. It had given them back their lives, and now it was giving others the chance to heal as well. As they looked toward the future, Arthur and Julia knew that there would be more challenges ahead. They would have to balance the growing community with the need to protect the sanctity of Ravens Hollow. But they felt ready. The family once broken had found a new sense of unity. Ranger, ever the faithful companion, continued to lead them forward, showing them the way, guiding them through the ups and downs of their new life. For the first time, Arthur and Julia were filled with hope, not just for themselves, but for the world around them. They had found something truly special, and they were determined to protect it, to nurture it, and to share it with others who needed healing. As they sat together that evening, Ranger curled up at their feet, they knew that their journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. But in that moment, surrounded by their family and their loyal dog, they felt a deep sense of peace. They had found their place in the world again, and with Ranger at their side, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. In the end, Ravens Hollow became much more than a place of refuge for Arthur and Julia. It transformed into a symbol of hope and resilience, a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their animal companions. Ranger, the ever-loyal German Shepherd, proved time and again that the love and devotion of a dog can be a life-changing force. His presence was not just comforting, it was healing. Through his unwavering loyalty, Ranger guided his family through the darkest of times, showing them that even in the most challenging circumstances, love and connection can offer profound healing. German Shepherds, known for their intelligence, loyalty, and protective nature, are often seen as guardians in more ways than one. They are more than just pets. They are family members, guardians, and symbols of unconditional love. Ranger embodied these qualities, and in doing so, he became a key to unlocking the family's healing and a reminder of the value of animal companionship. The journey of Arthur and Julia, along with Ranger, highlights the transformative power that animals have in our lives. They not only bring joy and protection, but can also heal our spirits, giving us a reason to move forward. The story of Ravens Hollow teaches us that healing comes in many forms: physical, emotional, and spiritual. It reminds us of the importance of kindness, forgiveness, and resilience. And, above all, it teaches us that true healing begins with love. The love we give and receive, whether from family, friends, or our loyal pets. The connection between humans and animals like that of Arthur, Julia, and Ranger is a powerful reminder that love and loyalty are the greatest forces for change in this world.